I would like to explain two things in this presentation. The first is the concept of time triggers, and the second is the concept of duration. Now, duration is the period of time between two points of time. So I think the most clear example of duration will be that a human being is born, so that is the date of birth or the moment of birth, and then the same human being dies, that's the moment of death. And between these two moments is the duration that we call lifespan. So duration is simply a span of time between two moments. I call it T1 and T2. T1 is the first moment when a thing begins to occur, and T2 is when the thing ceases to function or comes to an end. So duration is simply the time span between T1 and T2. So the moment of birth will be T1, and the moment of death will be T2, and the time between T1 and T2 will be the lifespan or the duration of life, if you will. Now, most things that we do in our life, they have trigger points or time triggers, and then we have durations between the two time triggers. And I think it's important to understand the significance of both time triggers as well as durations. Because when we say time or temporality, we don't necessarily make distinctions between time triggers and duration. And I think for analytical purposes, this distinction is very significant. Because a lot of things that we do depend on both time triggers as well as durations. We are very sensitive to time triggers, and we are very sensitive to durations. For example, in Islam, the five prayers, the daily five prayers, they have time triggers. For example, the morning prayer, there's a certain time moment when the prayer time begins. And then there is a certain time moment when the prayer time ends. So you have to say your morning prayer during that time, that span between T1 and T2 for the Fajr prayer. Similarly, there's a T1 and T2 for the Dhuhr prayer, and there's a span in between in which you say your prayer. Even in secular things, for example, a class begins at 9:30 and it ends at, let's say, 10:15. So T1 is 9:30 and T2 is 10:15, and the duration of the class will be 45 minutes between T1 and T2. Similarly, the train travel or the airplane travel, it begins and then it ends. We have a T1 and then we have T2, and the flight time will be between T1 and T2. Now, of course, some events are very precisely calibrated, and T1 and T2 are very precise. I mean, you can express each moment of time, T1 or T2, very precisely. For example, you could say that T1 begins at 10 past 12 o'clock. So T1 is 12:10. Or you can say T1 is the afternoon of Wednesday, which is less precise. Or you can say T1 is the second Wednesday of September. Or you can say it is going to be exactly 2 hours at 2 o'clock, exactly 2 o'clock, not a minute or second on this or that side. So you can define a moment of time either in seconds or milliseconds, or in minutes or hours, or in years, in macro units or micro units, depending on the sensitivity of T1 and T2. I think I've mentioned before that some very precise machines and technologies, they require very precise trigger points. So T1 or T2 will be very precisely defined, sometimes in milliseconds, whereas more routine events may be defined less precisely, but nevertheless, more precisely than saying I will see you in the evening. So time triggers have played a very important role in organizing legal events as well as social events. For example, law may say that you can drive when you are 16. So turning 16 is a trigger point, or is a time trigger, because it gives you the power to get a license and drive. So if you're T15, if you're only 15 years old, you don't have this power. But when you turn 16, you have the power to drive. Similarly, most rights are given to an individual when they turn 18. So T18, that means when you turn 18, triggers a whole set of rights for you which were not available to you before that point in time. So a time trigger is a point in time, either very precisely defined or defined in some macro or micro unit, or even in conventional divisions of time. So law takes time triggers very seriously. And I think modern life will not be fully organized if we don't take time triggers seriously, and if we don't take duration seriously. For example, a class cannot keep going. The duration of a class must be respected. In other words, if the class begins at 10:30 and it ends at 11:15, then both points in time, 10:30 and 11:15, these trigger points will have to be respected, because the duration between these 2 points is important, and we just cannot not pay respect to the duration of the class, because a teacher is going to design the class materials or class presentation or teaching materials for that class, keeping in view the duration of the class. I think in more casual settings, for example, if I invite you for the evening for a get-together, then the duration is more flexible. I might say, please come at 7:30 in the evening, and you might be 15 minutes late, or you might be 10 minutes late. In some cultures, people are late by half an hour or 1 hour, but that's cultural. But once the gathering has been established, then there might not be a very precise T2 or exit time. And or people may leave, as they need to go, and the gathering or the meeting or the evening may last for sometimes unspecified duration of time. So, depending on the nature of the activity, sometimes the duration is flexible, and sometimes the duration is very precisely defined. Sometimes the expectation is that the duration will be respected. For example, when we fly, there's a flight time, which is the duration between takeoff and landing, and more or less we expect that airlines respect the scheduled duration of the flight, unless there are exceptional circumstances. But under normal circumstances, the duration of the flight is expected to be precise, or it is expected to be in accordance with the schedule. And when the trains are late, and when the planes are late, or when they leave late, or when they arrive late, or when they take more time, between the takeoffs and landing, then our expectations are frustrated, and we don't feel, very good about it. So an evening get-together where the duration is flexible, and a flight time where the duration is more precise, we have very different psychological reactions to the expected duration of an event. Some events, if the duration is more flexible, then we enjoy the flexibility of the duration. But some events, we are frustrated if the duration is not respected. For example, if a speaker is scheduled to speak for 15 minutes, but he keeps on going and speaks for 20 or 25 or 30 minutes, even though he's a good speaker, I think people in the audience are going to be a little bit frustrated that the speaker is not observing the duration that was scheduled for his or her speech. So it's very interesting that human beings react very differently to both trigger points and as well as durations. In some cultures, time triggers are more respected than others. I think more punctual cultures, they expect time triggers to be followed, whereas more relaxed cultures, there the time triggers are not as important, because the expectations are that a given time trigger is just a sort of rough guideline. If I ask you to come at 7, it really doesn't mean 7. It means, around 7. So there is flexibility of the time trigger. I think what I want to discuss is that the human affairs and the natural affairs should be distinguished, because human affairs and social affairs and legal affairs, there the time triggers and durations are very deliberately designed. Whereas the natural phenomena or natural events, they do have time triggers and they do have natural durations, but human beings just observe them or just follow them or accept them. And they have not much control over changing some natural time triggers and some natural durations. For example, look at the cycle of seasons. Now there is spring, there is summer, there's fall, there's winter. And these 4 seasons, these are durations within a year. And we will have, in the natural setting, a duration for the winter, which may not be very precisely definable. I think we can say that summer begins on such and such day and it ends on such and such day, but it's very possible that the day the summer officially begins, it's rather a cold day, relatively speaking. And the day before, the last day of the spring was actually very hot. So even though we have a human superstructure of seasons, but the underlying natural cycle of seasons is there. I mean, there is a period that we call winter, and there's a duration of that winter, and there's a duration of summer, but it may not be as precisely definable as we can define a more artificially designed human event. But even though the natural events, the time trigger for natural events, and the duration of natural events are seemingly less precise or maybe somewhat unpredictable, that doesn't mean that nature does not have time triggers or nature does not have durations for events. For example, the duration of the day and the duration of the night, they're more or less predictable, even though the duration of the day changes. Days are longer in summer and they're shorter in winter, and the nights are longer in winter and shorter in the summer. But there is, there are trigger points and there are durations, whether it is winter or summer. And there's also some sort of logical progression within the natural setting for both time triggers and durations. The sun rises and the sun sets, and we have very scheduled, precise time schedules built on when the sun would rise and when the sun would set. And we structure a lot of our events accordingly. So both nature and human events that we deliberately design, they both have time triggers and they both have durations. So I think we have learned from nature the concept of time triggers and the concept of durations. And therefore we have incorporated the concept of time triggers and durations into our human organization of events. So ultimately, you would say that time triggers and durations are part of the nature, and they're meta-human. And human beings have borrowed these concepts through intelligence and observation and understanding of the natural phenomena. Now, sometimes there is incompatibility between artificial trigger points and natural trigger points. The human trigger points do not completely follow the natural trigger points. For example, the greatest example would be the concept of puberty or the concept of adulthood. Now, puberty does not magically come at the age of 18, or for that matter, any artificially designed trigger point. I think for administrative convenience purposes, most legal systems have concluded, and now there's an international rule on this point, that a child is defined as a person below the age of 18. So we have defined childhood as a duration of 18 years, lasting from the date of birth to the completion of the 18 years. And this period is called childhood. And we deny certain rights to children, and we offer certain protections to children defined in terms of a span of 18 years. But puberty and mental maturity does not follow this mechanical formula. For example, a 14-year-old may be very mature as compared to a 16-year-old. So some teenagers are much more intelligent, and I would say mature, than some other persons who are 20 or 21. So we follow, if we analyze teenagers, then we find that they have different levels of maturity and different levels of intelligence and different levels of decision-making accuracy or decision-making maturity. But we cannot, for legal purposes, define adulthood in terms of person-specific adulthood. Even though in criminal law, if a person commits a crime, even though he's a minor, which means he's not an adult, he's not yet 18, but we might still try him as an adult, because given his level of maturity, given the nature of the crime that he has committed, the circumstances surrounding that crime, the prosecutor might decide that this particular minor is indeed acting as an adult, and therefore he should be tried as an adult, and he may not be able to get the benefits of a juvenile because the legal system might treat juveniles a little bit more leniently than the legal system treats adults. So we find that even law might create exceptions and pay attention to the facts of a person, very special circumstances of a person, in order to take that person out of the big block defined in terms of artificial trigger points and durations. But the nature itself, it seems like, is not that mechanical. And nature has much more flexibility and variety in terms of trigger points and durations. For example, look at the life of an individual. I think very rarely would two individuals would have the same lifespan. It's possible that two children are born exactly at the same point in time. So the trigger point for their birth is exactly the same. But their life duration may not be the same. I think most likely it is not going to be the same. So very seldom do we see that people have exactly the same lifespan. I think the lifespan varies, definitely in months and days and hours and minutes, and definitely in seconds and milliseconds. I don't think any two lifespans are exactly equal in duration up to milliseconds. So we find that nature loves diversity, and nature does not follow very rigid formula in terms of its events, and it generally does have a concept of duration, but the duration is flexible. Even pregnancy, for example, is flexible. We have a rough, principle that pregnancy is going to last, 9 months or 40 some weeks. But no pregnancy is exactly the same or according to the formula. I think each pregnancy varies in duration, particularly if you measure duration in minutes and seconds and milliseconds. Sometimes even in days, there is a difference. So, human events and human durations can be defined very mechanically and very rigidly. But natural events are much more flexible. Whether it is the duration of the pregnancy, whether it is the duration of a lifespan, whether it is the duration of winter or summer, whether it is the duration of the life of a flower, or whether it is the duration of the life of a butterfly, we find tremendous diversity and flexibility in terms of durations in the natural phenomena. And therefore, when human beings construct a very rigid concept of durations, which we are increasingly doing, because I think our contemporary life, which is technology driven and which is driven by clocks and watches and now digital time, I think we have constructed a system or a culture or a society or a way of thinking where durations are more and more precisely defined. And so we are departing from the diversity and flexibility that we find in nature. That nature is indeed, very comfortable in flexibility of durations, in flexibility of trigger points. The winter may trigger in 2014 differently than it triggered last year. So we find that there is unlimited diversity and flexibility in natural trigger points and in natural durations. But human systems are becoming more and more precise, both in terms of trigger points and in terms of durations. And sometimes the incompatibility between nature and human society is obvious. And I think human beings are probably, because they're part of nature, are more comfortable with flexibility and diversity in terms of trigger points and durations, and they feel a little bit constrained and stressed when they are, forced to follow trigger points and durations very precisely. And I don't know to what extent are we going to alter the human nature and make it follow the trigger points and durations more rigidly and more precisely. Because by nature, we are flexible, and by nature, we are not designed to follow very rigid trigger points and very rigid durations of time. But since we have invented clocks and watches, and we have invented a culture where trigger points and durations are very precise and precisely defined, therefore I think human beings are departing from the natural phenomena and creating a human reality which is less flexible and perhaps less diverse in terms of trigger points and durations. Now that brings me to the concept of Flextime that I have argued is more in sync with our natural construction and our nature. Now, Flextime is simply that I think its meaning in the context of employment is that employees should be given the freedom to adjust their working hours. I think if you go back 30, 40 years, the tyranny of the trigger points and the tyranny of the duration was at the optimum, at the peak. And particularly in industrialized nations, you will have to come to work precisely at a given time, and you have to work for a set duration, and then you leave, at a set time. So this 9 to 5 day, for example, was very rigidly defined. And if you are late and if you go early, your employer was not happy with you, and perhaps it was a ground to fire you. Maybe it still is that if you don't, follow time, the trigger points, and if you don't follow the durations, you might be fired or you might not be promoted. But increasingly, I think human beings have begun to realize, and the employers too, that the productivity is more important than the schedule. Of course, sometimes schedule is very important. For example, if there's a meeting, then people have to be on time in order for that meeting to occur. So certain human events would always require that trigger points and duration should be precisely followed. And I think that point cannot be denied. We simply cannot rule out precise trigger points and precise durations from the realm of human cultures and societies. In fact, cultures and societies that don't develop respect for precise trigger points and durations, probably they are very inefficient and things don't get done. But on the other hand, you simply cannot define everything in precise trigger points and in precise durations. I think flex time is a beautiful concept that takes us back to nature. Flex time means that the trigger points as well as durations are somewhat open to change, open to alteration, and open to adjustment. For example, you may come at 7:30 instead of at 9 because the trigger point of 9 o'clock is not important for your work. You may start work early and leave early. You may work 10 hours one day and 6 hours the next day. So if you have to work 40 hours a week, you don't have to work 5 days, 8 hours a day, which is very mechanical and mathematical division of work. That you work 40 hours, you work 5 days, you work 8 hours a day, 8 times 5 is 40. Now, of course, you can work 4 days, but work 10 hours each day. Or you may work, 6 days. Maybe your family situation is such that you would rather work fewer hours each day because you have to take care of your children or you take care of a sick parent, and you simply cannot be out for 8 hours a day. So we are finding that flex time and even flex space, it's not just flex time, it's also flex space, that you don't have to come to a certain building called the workplace in order to do your work. I think with computers and with modern technologies, now people can work from anywhere. They can work from cafes, they can work from their homes, they can work from trains, they can work in planes, they can work in another country, in another continent. Actually, this whole idea of spatio-temporal flexibility is revolutionizing and taking us back, I would say, to our natural flexibility in both trigger points and durations. Because as I stated earlier, nature loves flexibility, both in terms of time and in space. And therefore, human systems, they are much more in harmony with the laws of nature. And human beings will be much less stressed stressed, I would say, and they would be happier, and they would be in sync with their deep nature and their profound relationship with nature. If the workplace and if the social structures and if the legal structures also are designed on the principle of flexibility and diversity. So flexibility with respect to trigger points and flexibility with respect to durations. Similarly, diversity with respect to trigger points and diversity with respect to durations. Because what is good for me in terms of duration may not be good for another person. So I think even though it is a little bit inefficient to accept flex time and flex space in order to give more freedom to individuals. But that is what is most in harmony with our foundation in nature. And I think that's the point that I want you to consider when you're designing a human system. That flexibility of trigger points and flexibility of durations, if these can be done, then that's what should be done. And a mere mechanical and unthinking view of trigger points and durations cause more stress, and the so-called efficiency ultimately does not work.